So, welcome back. So, what I did was, instead of waiting the 20 or 25 minutes, I got a hairdryer and I used that to dry off the surface of the painting because the white spirits dries by evaporation, so the hairdryer allows it a little bit of heat to dry much more quickly. And that's a little tip for you if you're not willing to wait the 25 or 30 minutes that one needs to do. Okay, so as I said, I've completed stage one. The next step now is to start layering up the colours and giving a little bit more depth, particularly to the likes of the yellow greens here and the lights into these spaces, and then to consider what I'm going to do with my background. I will be speeding up the process a little on the video so that you don't have to see every single line mark and tick being painted, and allow just to see it happen at a slightly faster rate. So I'm going to start with the likes of my white and my yellow. So I'm going to take a little bit of my chrome yellow and white, and I'm not thinning out so much now. If I was going to thin, I have a little bit of liquid, which is a slightly more modern equivalent than linseed oil. Linseed oil tends to prolong the drying process a little bit more. Liquid allows you to thin the paint, maintain the body. It gives a lovely feeling of luminosity to it, and it's great for glazing and things of that nature, but it dries much more quickly than the likes of linseed, or even the 50-50 mix, which is linseed oil and white spirits or turpentine. I'm going to just use that. I'm going to start introducing, I'll put a little bit of liquid actually into that. I'm going to start introducing some of that colour here into these spaces. Now, as I said, I don't know exactly what I'm going to do. It's a feeling. I paint by feeling. I gauge as I go along and make adjustments as I go along. So it's important that you try and do the same thing too. Don't feel that you have to know everything about what you're doing. It is a playful and organic process, not unlike the drawing. It's the same idea. And now I'm adding a little bit of light green in because there's a lovely sense of soft light green just showing through here and there. It's very faint, but it is still there. Once more, I'm not concerned whether or not the colours I use are precisely the same as the photograph or the reality. When I paint anything, unless it's particularly a portrait that somebody's looking for, I allow a lot more opportunity to play and interpret the colours. So if they tend to turn out slightly differently, that's perfectly fine. It's entirely up to you. Remember, it's your painting. So you have the choice to create it the way you wish, using the colours, shapes and forms that you wish. So never be afraid to experiment, never be afraid to explore, never be afraid to express yourself in what you're doing, because that's how you learn. So much of what we learn in both drawing and painting, as I said earlier, happens by accident. It's not what you know that teaches you, it's what you don't know and the mistakes you make. So one of the most important things to learn from the very beginning and to maintain throughout your entire period of a career of painting is that it's about being willing to express and explore and make mistakes. You have to be willing to let mistakes happen. And I don't even like the word mistakes, because it's not a mistake. Painting, as I said, is an organic process. Things go wrong, and it's how you resolve those elements that don't work for you that teaches you more about what you need to know. So what you know is history. It's what you don't know and how you resolve those issues that teaches you more about the creative and painting and drawing process. There's a beautiful rich green onto this Granny Smith apple over here on the right hand side that I've cut up, and I want to get a feeling of that. Now, when I'm painting, I tend not to necessarily stay in one place. I move around the canvas, and particularly if I'm trying to be loose, I don't end up being too... Particularly if I'm trying to be loose, I don't want to be too rigid in one space, so I move around if I see different spaces, different colours. So I'm not trying to finish any one thing at any one time. I work each of the elements up periodically as I go along, and I try and maintain a sense of freedom. And that way, if things happen to work differently to that which I intend or expect, then I get the opportunity to allow that to happen. Whereas if I work exclusively with one thing, I can end up becoming a little bit more tunnel vision in my painting. Whereas if I keep a loose approach to everything, it allows for a much more natural unevenness, which is oftentimes what I'm searching for. And I'm putting a little bit of the green that I'm putting into the apple, I'm putting it into the shadow space here, because I want to convey the idea that there's a little bit of reflection from particularly a sheeny surface like an apple. Because it has a soft, smooth surface, it reflects colour, and so it can reflect back into its own shadow. And it intends to make the composition more interesting that way, and also the use of colour a little bit more interesting that way. Now you can see I'm not washing my brush very often. I tend to keep the same colours on the brush, purposely to give a certain degree of influence from one colour onto another. Now again, because this is going to be a brighter space, there's light, and I explained this when we were doing the drawing, there's light on the surface here which reflects back up into the apple, so I see a little bit of brightness here. I also see, as the light comes in from the left hand side, it's reflecting onto the side of the apple here, which in turn reflects back into this apple on the left hand side. But apart from that, and in conjunction with that, this apple is casting a shadow onto this apple, hence we get a certain darkness there. So there's a lovely dynamic of different lights and darks in juxtaposition, playing with one another and creating a little bit more drama and liveliness. And similarly so with the idea of the negative space where there's the various different triangles. And this is why I always work, as I said to you in my drawings, I always work with my positive spaces first. So I'm painting the apples first, and then I'm going to use the background as a negative space to create much more depth and liveliness and playfulness, and to bring them out and create a much more dramatic feeling of three-dimensionality into the composition itself. Now, taking a little bit of blue and using a slightly mauvey grey across the surface of the apple here. And when you're painting, it's important to remember that nothing is finished until everything is finished. So you can only progress each area a certain amount, and then you have to move on to another space. But also, as I paint these, I'm aware that what I've not yet done with my background is going to have a very dramatic influence on shaping the various different elements of the apples up and giving much more drama and depth to them, and similarly the shadow. So I have to be trying to use my mind's eye. I'm all the time using my mind's eye to try and get a sense of how this is going to look as I progress into it, and build in and layer in. Now I'm going to start putting in some preliminary feelings of light here and there, just to give myself the opportunity to see how things are working out. I don't finalise my highlights till the very end, but I do put in some preliminary layers of light, so I get that sense. Now, as I've introduced some preliminary lights, I'm now going to introduce some preliminary darks, just to help feel my way through and get a sense of where everything is in terms of its strength and contrast with the colours in the middle. I've given a second stage, as you can see, to the fruit. I've built up and layered up some colours into the general ideas of lights and darks here, here and here. So I'm now going to do the same with the shadow and my background, again just to try and get that feeling of the overall sense of freedom that I'm creating at this stage. You can see that I'm just tapping in strokes into the shadow space. Once more, not trying to be too perfect or too rigid or too organized in what I'm doing. And I'm letting the different colours sit there with a certain degree of unevenness and freedom at this stage. And I'm thinking that I'll just continue with the same idea that I started with some sense of just broken ideas of dark background, so that I don't want a rigid background. I want something that just sits there and creates a sense of freedom and boldness in what I'm trying to do. So just a variety of greys I think I'll probably work with, rather than being too neat and tidy. Now, to give a little bit more fluidity to it, I'm adding some liquid so it allows the colour to move with a little bit more immediacy. And to maintain a sense of interest in my background, as with the foreground shadow, again, I'm just chopping into it. I don't want to have a nice smooth background. I'm looking for something that's very broken and playful. And as before, as I said at the beginning, I'm keeping the outlines quite soft on the shadows as well at this stage. I may strengthen them, I'll judge that as I go along. Now, I like that. I like the way in which the colours are coming together. I like the way in which the brush strokes are coming together. I like the way in which the general sense of freedom is coming together into what I have. So now I'm just going to take a few moments just to pause at this stage and just to have a look at what I've got, what I've done so far, and then decide exactly what I want to do going forward from here into the next stage.